The other way to approach it is to just take each number by itself and identify which of the categories or subsets does this number fall into. And so I'm going to go through that method with you guys. And if you want to watch the other method, you'll need to just refer to a video capture later in the week. Okay. So let's kind of talk through this, and we'll go through each of these. Okay, so -8. What is the most specific classification for the subcategory of real number that -8 falls into? It's an integer. So we can say that this is an integer, z. Okay, which means if it's an integer, it's also considered what? Rational and real. Okay, so -8 would fall into all three of those classifications. Okay, what about -square root of 8? Okay, does the square root of 8 reduce down to an integer value? No. So you know that it can't even be a rational number. It's an irrational number. That's the most specific case for it. And if you have an irrational number, are irrational numbers still considered real numbers? In order for something to be a real number, it has to have a location on a number line that you can represent it. So could you plot -square root of 8 on a number line? Yeah, there's a specific location for that. So that means it is, in fact, a real number. And what about the cube root, negative cube root of 27? Okay, so think about what cube roots are. Have you guys ever been exposed to those in algebra? Roots other than square roots? Okay, whatever number happens to be here, this is called an index, and we'll talk more about it later in the year or later in this semester. But whatever number this is, the simplified form is there a base that you can take to the power of this number, 3, that gives you the value inside your radical? So what number cubed is equal to 27? And the answer is 3, right? 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. So this has a value of -3. Okay, the negative out front, and then the cube root of 27, which is 3. And so we look to see what's the most specific classification for -3. Again, it's not a whole natural. It is an integer, though. So it's integer, which means it's a rational number, which also means it's a real number. Okay, what about 27? What's the most specific classification for 27? It is a positive counting number, so that's natural number, which means it will also be a whole number, which means it's also an integer, which means it's also a rational number, which means it's also a real number. So 27 is going to be all of those. Okay, what about 0.8? Does 0.8 fit into any of these most specific cases, natural or whole? Is it an integer? No, integers don't include decimals. So we move up. Can you express that as a fraction? Yeah. And again, anytime you're dealing with, and we'll talk about this here in more detail in a second, but if you're dealing with a terminating decimal, the way that you can express the decimal form, or I'm sorry, the rational form of this, is to take all of the digits of your number. So here, the only digit is 8, and divide it by 10 to the power of however many digits fall after your decimal point. So there's only one digit after this. So what we are looking at is 8 over 10 is the rational form for this. So that means that this does in fact have a rational form. It's a rational number. And if it's rational, it also means it's a real number. And what about the square root of -8? Can you take a square root of a negative number? No, so this isn't even considered a real, so this would be the case none. It falls into none of those categories. It's not irrational, and it's not it's not any of those classifications. Okay, finally, what is 0 divided by 27? Has a value of 0. Okay, so anytime you're looking to classify these, even if it's written in a different form, you use the value of it to express the number. And so 0, what's the most specific classification for 0? 0 is a whole number. So it's a whole, which means it's also an integer, which means it's also rational, which means it's also real. Okay, pi. Pi is it's a symbol to represent an irrational number. So we have an irrational, which also means it is contained in the real number system. You can plot the point that represents pi on a number line, so it is a real number. And then finally, negative 8 divided by 0 has a value of, you cannot divide by 0, so it's undefined, which means it's not even a real number, so it has no classifications.